are walking the same path.
I think intimacy has a lot to do with trust and respect, right? And how two people approach the issue of being sexually intimate has a lot to do with how much they trust and respect that person. Either it's in the moment or over time.
I remember a lot of the stuff you taught me. Intimacy is not. It's just a misinterpreted word in our language as men. It's become sex. It's become sexual gratification. It's become sexual conquest. And intimacy is a feminine word. And a lot of us
viewed as a feminine word.
Yeah. And today, men, to identify just that word feminine, is something that we have to identify and work. That's why you have homophobia, and because anything that identifies with feminine is going to be kept at bay. And we grow up like that, like King of the Hill.
Well, yeah, men are more fearful of gender slippage than they are of any physical encounter that they come across, right? If you have your sexuality challenged in some way, your manhood challenged in some way, that's a bigger deal to many men than any physical encounter that they come.
We just had a two-spirited training, and there was a young man that came in and I'm going to be honest here. He says, I struggled. Should I come? Shouldn't I? Should I come? Shouldn't I come? And the only reason he was questioning is because he didn't want people to think him coming to a two-spirited training that they might think he's two-spirited. and that's the struggle we men go through. Is always being in our place, what we were taught. And masculinity and intimacy aren't in the same sentence, and that's what we grow up around, that masculinity.
We haven't had a lot of training on intimacy as men, right? I think we fear intimacy. I mean, I think men are more threatened, or at least as threatened, by when a woman if you have a woman as a partner, and I'm speaking of that just in those terms. I mean, I can't speak for women, but I'm just thinking that oftentimes men that I work with, or men that I know as friends or colleagues or relatives, if their partner has a close kind of emotionally, spiritually, intellectually intimate relationship with somebody else, they are just as threatened about that than any sexual experience that their partner may have with somebody else. And I think that it's even easier for them to get over a sexual tryst that they may have, if that's the right word, with somebody else than they are that it's much easier for them to get over that kind of experience than it is for she's developed this close emotional, spiritual relationship with somebody else, and that's something that I haven't reached with, because we take our partners for granted, because we confuse that intimacy and intensity as the same thing, and just because there may be some kind of sexual access that's allowed in your relationship, people have sexual experiences for lots of different reasons, passion and compassion and recreation, and and there's lots of different reasons why people do that. Another reason is obligation. People feel obligated, right? And men will pout, right, about not having sex, but they don't think about the fact that just because you got off in this experience, it might not have been anything more than an obligation for the other person. It didn't bring you any closer together, and as a matter of fact, it might have caused distance between the two of you, because the other person is forced to give something of themselves that is being taken for granted.
When we're talking about intimacy, it reminds me of, back in 1990, when we were from the beginning, we were always critical of the Duluth curriculum. The critical part, was there wasn't hardly any positive
Right.
in there.
Right.
And so in 1990, some of us got invited to Duluth and to develop the positive will. And when we left there, after that week, the middle wasn't equality; it was intimacy. And when Ellen and Michael sent me, the rough draft, and I noticed that in the middle it changed there to equality. One of the first things I thought about, the men are going to say 50-50. That's what equality is, and a relationship's not about 50-50. But going back to the concept of intimacy, she said the people that they take their ideas to, I don't know if it's a common council or what, basically laughed them off and said, how do you expect to get a batter to be intimate after 24 weeks? It's just not possible. So as I looked at it, and remember some of the conversations around it, because what I brought into it was Lakota value, and some of the values that we as Lakota people have, the respect, trust, and that my understanding of it, when you take a look at the behaviors and the thinking processes that happen on the equality wheel, when we agree that it should be intimate, is that as a man, that's what your thinking is more like. We're trying to get these men to be respectful, to be trusting and supportive, and being a good partner, being a good parent, sharing that the economic part of it, the spirit, the spiritual part of it. Later, we added the spiritual and cultural part, and the issues around intimidation and isolation, and if you're not that, then you're more likely to be able to have an intimate relationship with your partner, whatever that may be, whoever that may be, whether it's a opposite sex or a same sex relationship.
Oh yeah, I think it leads to gender issues with men. We have a hard time being close with each other, and I'll bet those of us in the room right now would have a greater comfort level talking about more intimate kinds of conversations, because there is trust and support and respect and all those things involved, right? And a much more intimate kind of relationship than maybe other men do. But then other men are just are fearful of that. What does that mean? Intimacy is a power in itself. You talk about power and control and those kinds of issues, but I think we also do a disservice to things, because intimacy, respect, honor, accountability, these things are really powerful things. They're positive power, right? And if we can't get ourselves and other men to look at how those things are just as powerful as finances and physical strength and sexual prowess, right? If we can't see that they're just as powerful, then it's always going to be, those guys, Marlon and Gene, they're trying to disempower us, right? They're trying to castrate us, right? No, we're just saying that there's different kinds of power, and that you can seek balance and have even more power, make closer relationships, even more powerful relationships, by increasing these kinds of power and diminishing the physical, sexual, financial.
Well, I think all of our conversation, in that, in coming from that belief system that we come from as men, and then you end up in a men's program. You're trying to teach them about that intimacy, but it comes from the superficial.
Yeah.
As men, we're just superficial. Hey, how you doing? What's the guy gonna say? Good.
Yeah.
And if he's to say not so good, then it's not superficial.
Yeah, right.
Then we're gonna talk, have a conversation
Right.
about something.
Yeah, they're fearful of intimacy. They're
Right.
fearful of you
Right.
having a conversation about how you're really doing.
Right.
Right?
Right. So I think that's what was created here is, you know, it was something that we could be okay around the ceremonies, around the groups, but to be away from the fire. And it was a conscious effort. I used to take the guys out to eat, and just to have conversation, to be comfortable with each other. You know? And I think that's where we've come today, is being comfortable with each other to share our fears and our hurts and our expectations, you know, that we go through in life, you know, relationships, you know. So you have somebody that is willing to listen. It's the willingness to listen.
Yeah, and then the crying part.
Right.
You know, a lot of men are real fearful of crying, and you know, one of the things that hit me as a ton of bricks. You know, when I tried to understand language more. You know, because it's Lakota, I think, just like any indigenous language, is really powerful when you understand it rather than transfer your colonized thought to say like prayer. You know, Wanawachikya.
Yeah.
You know. And not realizing in that word, wochea, you know, chea means cry, you know, and why would that word be in prayer if it didn't have significance?
Yeah.
And so a lot of, you know, even humblechea,
Yeah.
you know, when the rite of passage from boyhood to manhood, you know, is to go out, and because that's when you got that chanumpa to wochea, to pray. So you go out and learn how to cry. So from that point on, then when you obahi, or when you load that pipe and you cry, you're actually praying. You know, that's actually, you know, real significant, and that got lost in colonization, and I think it's still misunderstood today.
Well, the significance is that in this society we're taught not to cry, to be a man.
Yeah, because so then that would say, you know, in our cultures that you're not a man, and this was what I was told when I told my story at a Sundance and cried, and then in the ceremony, the medicine man said the spirit had a message for the man who cried, say that you're not a man until you can cry, which was just the opposite of what we were told, that men don't cry.
At all costs.
What confusing messages, you know, that men and women are brought up with around those issues. I mean, that what's more powerful than crying and laughing, right? And diminish either one of those, I think, does a disservice to us as men. There's a sacredness around just the act of crying, and it takes a certain amount of courage to do that. I mean, I still struggle with that. You know, I'll watch a movie or something, and I'll feel like, you know, a tear coming on, and I gotta like stifle it.
Your eyes are starting to water up.
Yes.
But when you go back to your question about intimacy, I think that that would be one of the ultimate forms of intimacy. You know, especially with your partners, to be able to share with them something, or cry. You know, and cry when you really need to. You know. Not when you have to, but when you need to.
Not when you're making up.
Because some men are the same way. And in that treatment, they use crying as a way to get her back.
Oh yeah, right.
And so you use it either way.
Right.
But
they'll use it as another control tactic,
right,
as opposed to as a way of getting in touch with something,
or being intimate.
Just talking about that, and crying, and being a recovering abuser, and 19 years old. I share this in group, and it's important I do, so the men know that I understand, about abuse towards women. And when I was 19, I was in a relationship with Mickey, and back then I'd take off for 3 days, cheat,
Yeah.
lived as I pleased. But when I knew she was going to leave me, I met her after work, and it's ironic. It was right in front of a church on 6th and Lincoln. I cried to her, I'll change, I'll stop hanging with my brothers, I'll come home at night, we'll do more, making her all these false promises. But when I knew, I even cried to her. I was crying to her when I was telling her these things. But when she said, no, I'm leaving you, when I knew she was leaving me, when I knew it's like I grabbed her by the hair and I said, can't you see that I love you? I really did. I loved her, and my beliefs, everything that I was taught about about my place, and when a woman hurts me, this is how you respond to it. When you love a woman, this is how when she hurts your love. It was something that I've always held on to, and I've never seen Mickey again. And I would love to, I guess, for me to understand it today, and where that kind of, I guess they call it Indian love today, but to understand that, and what made me do something like that was because I had learned this. We always talk about a learned behavior, but to emphasize hitting somebody in that manner and saying I love you, that's pretty contradictory, but it's all we have. It's all I had at that time. It was almost like that was my intimacy when people, I was letting myself cry, but that's how I expressed myself, by being intimate in that lifestyle and that belief system.
I think we've all heard that term so many times about Indian love, and what a disrespectful term that is about culture and heritage and relationships and gender and all the rest. Is just that we would allow that kind of minimization to be carried forth, right? But again, it was a belief system that was instilled in people, right? That makes it okay because it really means I love. Well, no, you don't. You're not really loving somebody when you're punching them in the face. That's not an act of love and kindness and intimacy.
But at the time,
Yeah.
it's all I had.
Absolutely. At the time, that was your understanding.
That's all that was taught me. That's all I seen. It was something that and I talked about this to the men, because I think a lot of the roots, and I always talk to the men about our first relationship. A lot of times we've been hurt, and a lot of times we've never healed from that hurt. And it's like you get into another relationship and you see something going on again, like she's going to leave you, and then it turns to violence. It escalates to violence. Because we've never healed from that hurt. Where do you go to heal from hurt? And I think that's one of the significant roles that I'm able to help the men understand how to appropriately express hurt. I was expressing hurt, and how do you appropriately express hurt? And that's part of that intimacy. Allowing yourself to express hurt appropriately. That's being intimate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one thing to say you're angry. It's something else altogether to be able to articulate. What is making you angry? Why are you angry? And again, that's being mixed blood. That from both cultures. That's it's a flaw in it's both cultures and in all cultures, right? That we don't know how to do that. We have to taught how to do that.
So you should probably do the current day stuff. Talk about how the guys are even like, well, we can't even say anything nowadays. But it's all of those pieces inside of there. So how about we just start out with talking about stuff going on current day's events and social media stuff around Me Too and times.
Yeah, I was just talking to a group, that we're going through this times of change, and a lot of men would think that we're losing something because these men of prominence are being held accountable for behaviors that happened maybe years ago, but it's carried on. They're men of status, men of that are being held accountable for their sexual misdeeds,
Aggressive actions.
and the reason I talk about it, because as men, it speaks to this sexual respect that I believe is within our culture as Native people, and to be able to the importance of it, of being able to recognize our values as Native men pertaining to women. And I give that a lot of thought. I give that a lot of, coming from that myself, and going through the healing of changing myself on the relationship to women, where today I speak for this issue as a man, and try to help other men. It's almost like they feel an intrusion on their rights as men, almost like we talk about the rites of passage. My rites of passage as a man was first time I had sex. Now I'm a man, it's like, and we grow up in a society where how we sexually objectify women, and now we're at a place where men are going to struggle and to where their place is. And I think that's the importance of this work in preparing men, and using our values and our culture, our spirituality to, it's always been there, except we have to go through this healing again, and be able to look at what society expected of us as men when it came to women, and what we need to expect of ourselves to be a Native man. I think that's really important.
When they're having the 2016 campaigns, and all this, was narrowed down to Hillary and Donald Trump, and I remember when the video in the audio clip came out of the conversation he had with the Bush guy, I can remember his name, Bobby Bush, and at first, because I was a supporter of Hillary Clinton, and you could take that out if you want. But anyway, when I first, when I first heard that, I think I, like a lot of people, thought that would be the nail in his coffin, as far as having any chance, and then I remember out jogging, and that was coming to my mind, and I thought, get in a different frame of mind, and I thought, how many men can identify, with that type of conversation? And I thought about the work that we do, and how many men do we really change sexually their thinking, given the limited amount of of time that we get to spend on that, and especially the thought processing and self-thought. And I thought, that I bet he's really appealing to a lot of men, with that talk, and even women, that thought can be, even probably a lot of women can, can be appealed to that thought, in that type of conversation that him and Bobby Bush were having.
Yeah.
And then I started to think about, what is this gonna do for the election? But I don't know if if it had any effect on it, but I thought this could here a lot of us are thinking it's going to have a negative effect, but I think to a certain population of men, it's going to have a positive effect. Say, hey, this guy's like us because he thinks like that and they talk like that, and that gives them validation to continue thinking and talking like that, about women, and how to get women, how to think about women. How you just go up to them and grab them.
I'd like to respond to the issue. I think that in any communication, it's always one person says the words and the other person interprets those words according to their history and herstory with that word and what that word means to them. And I want to give an honest, not just truthful, but an honest response to it. And I know I may be judged for this in some ways. So, first of all, I think it takes huge courage to come out. As a sexual assault survivor myself, it takes huge courage to be able to name that, and especially to name it against men in power. So I really admire the courage. But I also think about that it's similar to when in the 90s or the 80s or whenever it was when they started talking about the feminization of poverty, that they only started talking about the feminization of poverty or the effects of poverty on women when what started to be a large increase in majority culture women were showing up on welfare rolls. So then all of a sudden it was the feminization of poverty, not thinking about how poverty had affected women of color, disenfranchised women over the years. And now, the whole issue about, thankfully it's being brought forward by somebody, but again, it's only getting traction because majority culture women were coming forward and saying, I've been sexually assaulted, when women of color have been being, trafficked and abused and sexually assaulted and sold into sexual slavery and used as indentured service and all this for years and years and years, right? So that's just an emotional response that I have is that thank God it's finally coming to the surface. Maybe now we'll get more traction with it, but also the sadness that I have about our women have been suffering this for years. Women of color have been sold into sexual slavery for years, right? And they've been, discounted and not listened to and not heard and tossed aside for years. So yes, thank God that they're coming forward with it. Right? But the other response that I have to it is, boy, I think it's really important that we look at. Now men are coming forward. And, we have people in pastors and churches that are coming forward and saying, yes, boy, in my younger days, I sexually assaulted or I raped people. And then the whole congregation is cheering them on and supporting them for coming forward and being, telling some truth, not being completely honest, but telling some truth about their sexual assault experiences they perpetrated in the past. And that whole congregation is still not supporting victim survivors, right? That they're still not, they're not, putting their efforts towards supporting victim survivors, right? Men are coming forward and saying, okay, I did this and I'm sorry if it hurt someone. If is a huge word. It diminishes the apology in the first place. I don't think that apologies by themselves have much meaning. I think that they're short-sighted. I think that it really takes an acknowledgement about, not only did they do the behavior, but how that behavior has affected somebody, right? That how it's affected themselves, that it's given them more power, how it's disempowered that other, how that other person has had this life-altering trauma that follows them their whole life, right? And yes, people get really good at compartmentalizing it, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not there, right? And just the fact of somebody saying I'm sorry oftentimes is very triggering. So I think that we still need to be mindful and supportive of those victim survivors, and when this issue comes up, right? That somebody says, "I'm sorry if I've ever hurt you." All I can think about in my head is somebody said that to me was all the times that person has hurt me, right? If somebody says, "I'm sorry I called you a name," or if I came across, as aggressive, that wasn't my intent. Well, that's baloney. It was your intent, right? And so I think it's important that we consider that, right? That we still. My fear is that it'll move to people getting support for coming out and being, quote, and again I use it deliberately, truthful but not honest about their perpetration issues, and they'll get support around that, and we still won't be given adequate support and advocacy for those who have been victimized over the years.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about who's coming out and saying that, and I think when a lot of the Me Too movement and stuff start coming out, I remember some black woman, had been saying that for years, but never got any attention. But now, non-native women are coming out and they're getting all this attention. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but I think it lends to that who's saying it.
Right.
Because when I started sharing my story, back in the '80s, and people responding to it, say, "Oh wow, that's great that I share his story of being violent and his at that point, where he was at in his recovery." But I remember my sister colleagues, Tilly Blackbear, who's also one of my cousins, and Ellen Pence, had said, we've been saying those things for years, and we haven't gotten that same response from audiences that you get.
Absolutely.
You're a man.
Yeah. Again,
You're up there saying that.
Yeah.
Wow, and then we've been saying that for years, and we're man haters.
Right. Right. Yeah, we get accused as being man haters all the time when would we really choose to spend that much time with large groups of men, if we didn't feel like men could be better partners and better parents and better role models and better citizens, right? Right? So it's not that we're man haters, right? But again, you get that status for coming out, right? And for being on the road to recovery, right? Right? But we've always, I think the men, at least in this room, and honorable men who are trying to do this work, and of course we'd have to look at the definition of honor again, but the honorable men, have always been willing to understand that it's not just what they did, it's how it affected other people, and that we are works in progress and moving forward.
Why are men fearful of that change?
They don't. For one thing, in my opinion, would be that again a lot of men feel it's disempowering rather than looking at it that it could be empowering. I mean, I don't know about you two, but I've had more men come forward to me after really recounting in an honest way, not being truthful, but being honest, right, about what their behavior is and how it's affected them, that they've come back and they've a week or two later and felt like, wow, I feel lighter, right? I feel stronger in a way, because before, if I told my story and left out certain facts, then
how
I
change the conversation and say what's men's resistance to it.
Well,
okay.
I think it's the giving up the control, and it took me years to put how to explain that, or even explain myself. When I was making the changes, and Sherry and I went through a separation, and it was like it was the as I look back on it, it was the control aspect. And losing that control was like, it was totally, it's like my manhood was being taken away because I couldn't control her anymore. And, lucky for me, I had gone to alcohol treatment because I had the misconception that the alcoholism and drug use was creating the violence, and come to find out it wasn't.
Right.
It was the wanting to control her, every aspect of her life. And that was the scariest part for me. And over the years, sharing that story with men, say, for them, for a good number of them, that's been the case for them too, is that fear of losing control of them, which American society has, instilled in us and brainwashed us to think that we have to have that control. It makes me think of a guy in group member one time, and he had not said anything for a couple weeks or a few weeks, and then finally his first response is said, "You know what? It sounds like you're trying to brainwash us into thinking a different ways." I said, "How do you think we got to thinking the way that got us into these groups in the first place?"
Right.
And if you want to take a look at it as brainwashing, then, go ahead and use that term. I'm trying to brainwash you back into Lakota thinking, and not out of, dominant American male thinking.
Every aspect of our beliefs growing up in that dominant culture as men, around power and control, there's just a degree of vulnerability. Being vulnerable, of giving that control up. What is it that somebody else is going to take that control, because that control is our manhood. That control is what drives us to have that status, to be able to objectify. That's what our manhood is about in that belief system. So of course we're going to feel vulnerable of our manhood. And so we change our beliefs around manhood, of supporting, and I think it speaks to this Me Too, what our struggles are going to be as men, because we're going to be vulnerable. This is what makes me a man, to be able to objectify women, So it's like Marlon said, coming back from that brainwashing. We call it re-education. We're re-educating them back into what it is to be a Native man. So it's almost like if they want to see it as a brainwashing to come back to who you are, then that's for you to figure out. But we're going to present this information because we've been through it. We've believed that way, and we stand for this now, that we're trying to carry on the values of Native men, not just the holding the chanupa out there, sundancing, going on the hill that gives me a status, but to cry with that chanupa, to believe with that chanupa, to have that chanupa guide us and allow us to speak here today and really believe that. It just feels good to sit here and talk on this subject with, not in a group setting, but with men that were already there when I came. I've been doing this going on 20 years, and these men were here long before me. So they brought me to where I'm at today, and now I'm trying to pass that on with the same enthusiasm, with the same encouragement, because it's in my spirit now.
Yeah, we learn from each other, for sure.
And I think getting back to that Me Too movement idea, who makes me think of who's going to benefit from that, because do we see our Native women and girls benefiting from that? And if not, how do we create something that's beneficial to them? Is it continuing to share our stories, or for me, not being involved in group work, but for me, my role is for my grandsons and my adult children and their spouses, that I find a big teaching tool is in the sweat lodge, where you're darkened from your egos and your ignorance, and I was told a long time ago, if you want to really make an impact on somebody, tell them in the darkness, or tell them at night. And so I use that, that you need to be, to tell them and share with them the things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it impresses me that the boys, the teenage boys that come back and say, Grandpa, I had a lot of time to think about what you're saying in the sweat lodge,
I get that
good,
too
yeah.
because I do the sweat lodges with the men in the program, and I get that feedback too from them where they hear that they hear the spirit of it, of what you're trying to say, and it does come into them, and it's the honesty that it brings, the medicine that it brings, and being able to pass that on into their lives. I just believe that, you hear that it took us 500 years to come to this, and we're just like myself, just we're babies, but we have a spirit that has been corrected to a degree, and living in this society, that's a challenge.
Yeah, the fear of being judged by other men, and as Marlon and you both were saying, that the fear of giving up a certain amount of control, I think it is huge for men. Right? And they don't really look at the benefits. They look at how they may feel disempowered, and then they are fearful of having to challenge those basic belief systems that they've been living with for, I don't care if it's 15, 25, 35, whatever number of years it is. They've been operating under those belief systems, and it takes a certain amount of courage to be able to say, I don't judge people's belief systems. What I say, basically, does it really work for you? I mean, if it doesn't, you're the only one that can change that, right? Because it's the belief. You change the belief systems, the behaviors will change by themselves, right? Your feelings will change, your behaviors will change, right? If you just change the behaviors, you're just kind of trading them off. So there is that fear and that judgment that men experience. For sure.
I think the big payoff is in the energy. A lot of people, I think, don't talk about or understand it in the energy that can be actually felt. Like if you went to somebody's home unannounced and you walk in the door and you could just feel like they've been arguing or fighting just by what you feel, the energy you feel. Mm-hmm. And then it makes me think back to going to Grandma Pearl's house, and you walk in the door, and then you just feel like, and it took a long time to explain that, but you feel the love, and then you see her face smiling, and hello, tacos, come sit down and get you something to eat. Or when Grandma Ida used to come, and it took me years to put words to that. When I knew she was coming to stay, and sometimes she came and stayed with us for weeks and months at a time. When I get off the bus, live about a quarter mile from the house, just dashing to get home to that energy. And so that, when we have impact on men that I have, I'm not going to say all of them, but the ones that have been able to, to reflect that back, is the energy that you feel, and I imagine that you give off, not having to, wanting to have control anymore, and the energy that, that your grandkids must feel when they come over, and then they don't want to leave, maybe it's then that behavior and your belief systems have changed, and when that happens, but how do you articulate that to who we're trying to reach, and how does that play into the Me Too movement? How do we create the energy of respect, and especially respect and love for for the women that we're trying trying to help through this video, and is that, what is it specifically that, that is it, do they want for us to address, and I'm really glad, and Sherry and I have talked about it, the times it's been on the news is that, it's about time,
Yeah.
that they start talking about it at, at that
Absolutely.
level, and I'm glad for them, but
Yes.
what's the impact of that, because of course a lot of those women that have come out, and a big part of that Me Too movement are usually celebrities, right?
Right. And everyday woman, everyday girl, right? Again, they've been slogging through this issue for generations,
Yeah.
right? And so
And they've been coming out for generations, and
and
so
trying to be heard and telling their stories and not being believed. So my fear is that it's going to be okay. We'll have this big, and then we'll be like, oh yeah, well we dealt with that in 2017, with the Me Too movement. So now we can move on, rather than no. Let's look at this as just a starting point. It's like the men in the class. The goal isn't to get them to be respecting women. That should be the baseline. There should be an automatic respect for women, and then we build from that. How do we respect ourselves and everybody else, right? But it's not like, oh, the goal is to get somebody to a level of respect. It's like that should be the baseline. I mean, we don't want our girls growing up, with the goal to be respected. That should already be a basic expectation.
and I don't think I don't know if this is what they're after with that, but that when we're talking about goals and baseline, I learned about self-actualization back in 1984 at a training on counseling theories, and the doctors that explained that counseling theory, attached it to Abraham Maslow. And when they read off the 21 characteristics of self-actualization, it was a time when I was trying to understand who I was evolving into being nonviolent and giving up drinking and those things that in practicing holistic, in my mind, holistic out body, mind, spirit on a daily basis. And what I was evolving into, and when he read off the 21 characteristics of self-actualization, he said, I could see the light bulb going on for some of you, and I was one of them. I thought, wow, I could see myself in that, and it was for years. It's like I put that on the shelf. I knew it was there, but lately that's been coming back more and more. Of what when you take a look at those the characteristics of self-actualization, in them is non-violence, and the like the inner need to want to right wrongs. And so, oftentimes I'll say now is that maybe that should be the goal, of our not only working with men but women that want to come for us for help is, let's take a look at self-actualization,
Right.
the 21 characteristics. Where are we on that? What do we need to work on? And us for us in working in this field with men, of course they could probably identify with a lot of them, but really take a look at that, that need to control and the being violent, whether less than 1% of the time it's the physical, but the psychological and the
Right.
sexual, and,
Right.
and imposing the spirituality, however they define that on them, and so I think there's it's a old concept, and one of the things that he told us at the time was that Maslow didn't develop the 21 characteristics of self-actualization. It was developed by a guy named Erik Erikson, and Erik Erikson developed him when he lived in the village of Pine Ridge from 1955 to 1962. And I remember being in school with Eric Jr. and that's what it came back to me. Eric Erickson Jr. And the thing that reminded me of him was he could touch his nose with his tongue. And another synchronicity about that was, I remember being invited. He invited me to his birthday party, and years later, when we moved back to Pine Ridge, when we moved to the school housing, we moved into the house that they used to live in, the Ericksons. But I found out this summer, that there was there's other tribes, that Erickson and Maslow had visited, that will say the same things that I do. That Maslow lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation in Manderson during that same time period. That he was studying native cultures to find some people. Not only the goal, but the process to becoming a real human being, or in Lakota we say Ikjewichasha. So you take a look at those 21 characteristics of self-actualization. We could probably all see ourselves.
Yeah.
Oh,
in there
absolutely.
for a
It's
lot.
like your degree of honor is directly related to, the degree of which you've attained those 21 degrees of self-actualization, which again goes back to a native, indigenous mindset that's been adopted by majority culture, co-opted by majority culture, but it's really important information to have.